Yeah, so there's certainly a long potential list. It's funny. I was as I was preparing to talk to you today a little bit about this, I couldn't help think back to my days at Baker Hughes when I started there, and that was kind of when I started there was fresh off a lot of sanctions that had come down with regard to Crimea.
This is Tom Fox. We rarely get torn from the headlines episodes on the FCPA Compliance Report, but today we begin a special two-part podcast series with Matt Silverman. We're going to take a look at potential sanctions that could be levied against Russia if they invade Ukraine. Obviously, if this podcast posts after an invasion, it will be sanctions after an invasion. But in part one, we look at the potential sanctions the Biden administration could deliver against Russia. In next week's part two, we look at what you can do to prepare for such an eventuality. This special two-part episode is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again for another episode, and I'm thrilled to have back with me Matt Silverman. I asked Matt if he could help us understand some of the potential sanctions that might be levied if Russia invades Ukraine. We rarely have breaking news on this podcast, but we're recording this on Thursday, February 17th, and at least as of the time of the recording, there's been no invasion, but there's really no word of whether the risk of invasion has increased or decreased. So we wanted to go ahead and do this podcast because it's something that is on the radar of every trade compliance professional and, frankly, every business executive who literally does business from Russia to Europe, from Russia to China to the U.S. and back. So, Matt, with that incredibly long-winded introduction, thank you for taking the time to visit with me on this most significant topic.
Sure, Tom. Very, very happy to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
So, Matt, could we maybe start off by me asking you, what are some of the potential U.S. sanctions you see either in the hopper or even down the road if Russia invades Ukraine?
Yeah, so there's certainly a long potential list. It's funny. I was as I was preparing to talk to you today a little bit about this, I couldn't help think back to my days at Baker Hughes when I started there. And that was kind of when I started there was fresh off a lot of sanctions that had come down with regard to Crimea and the Russian invasion of Crimea. And I think it's certainly possible, based on what we've heard in the news and what the Biden administration has hinted to as to what may potentially be coming down the pike, that we may see a lot of sanctions similar to what we saw with the invasion of Crimea 7 or 8 years ago. The Biden administration has been working with, obviously within the administration, defense, state, commerce, and treasury, to put together what some Senate Republicans are calling the mother of all sanctions packages. So there's a lot of potential for some pretty drastic and widely impacting sanctions. Obviously, the most comprehensive and really what would be drastic would be a near complete embargo of Russia. So what we have similar to Cuba, Iran, Syria, and North Korea, and obviously there are some exceptions there with regard to all those countries, but those are what we call pretty much comprehensively embargoed countries. So it is possible, and we'll see what happens in the coming days and weeks with regard to an occupation of Ukraine, that Russia could move onto what we call the country group E list, which would basically make them equivalent to a North Korea or Cuba in terms of a comprehensive sanctions. So nearly all trade and investment of Russia would be restricted. And then we can kind of move a little bit down from there because it's probably not realistically what's going to happen. But there's a lot of other different options. So one is sanctions that are what we call sectoral sanctions, so related more toward certain sectors of Russia's industry. So we saw this with regard to the Crimea invasion so many years ago, for instance, the oil and gas sector. And there were certain sectoral sanctions placed on the energy and oil and gas sector in Russia, many of which still exist today. So it could be more of a focused sanctions package focused on Russia's energy or financial sectors. There's, of course, also the possibility that just certain exports of items or technology to Russia are going to be prohibited. So the statutory language will carve out whether it's certain aerospace products, defense products, computing, artificial intelligence products. There's quite a long list there, as you can imagine. So we're not talking about the exportation of food or automotives necessarily, but probably things like aerospace products, defense, artificial intelligence, other types of emerging technologies, and putting certain prohibitions on them. So it could be outright restrictions or denials, a presumption of denial from state or commerce if you're going to apply for a license to export X, Y, or Z, or just the requirement that you now need to submit for a license in order to export X, Y, or Z, depending on your industry. I think what is very possible and what a lot of people are talking about is the idea that certain Russian entities would be designated under the foreign direct product rule. So for those listening on the call who are kind of unfamiliar with this, the foreign direct product rule is a way that the U.S. government has found to reach the. We already have, the U.S. government already has quite an extraterritorial reach when it comes to the exportation of goods and services and products. The foreign direct product rule is a way to expand that reach even more, and the way it has been most famously or infamously, depending on your viewpoint, been used is with regard to Huawei in recent years. Both in the obviously in the Trump administration it started, and the Biden administration has really carried through the foreign direct product rule as it relates to Huawei, and potentially what we could see is an expansion of that rule as it relates to certain Russian entities. So basically the way that this plays out is, the U.S. controls anything that is exported from the U.S., anything that's manufactured in the U.S. for the most part, it is subject to U.S. export control laws. The extraterritorial scope of U.S. export control laws come into play when we talk about the de minimis rule, which is basically the U.S. government says, okay, we're not just going to control what is made here in the U.S. or exported from the U.S., but if you're manufacturing, let's say, a laptop in China or in Uruguay or in Panama or wherever it is, and 25% or more of that content is U.S. content, well, that is subject under de minimis to U.S. export controls. So that's one way that the U.S. government kind of expands the scope of their extraterritorial reach. The foreign direct product rule goes even further to say not only are we looking at the de minimis, whether it's 25%, 10%, et cetera, but anything really that is produced, manufactured abroad, if it is the direct product of U.S. origin technology, then it is subject to U.S. export control laws, which would mean that it is subject to whatever stricter export control laws or sanctions come into play with regard to Russia. So what the Biden administration could do is essentially expand the foreign direct product rule to not just include companies like Huawei, a Chinese telecommunications company, but other specific Russian companies. And it most likely wouldn't be applied to the entire country of Russia. It would be certain Russian companies. So if you're a U.S. company and you have a subsidiary in Europe, or you're a European company, you make a laptop or you make a semiconductor equipment, and some or all of that machine or product is the direct product of U.S. origin technology, right? Even if 99% of what's in that product is not manufactured in the U.S., you are still going to be subject to the foreign direct product rule. And therefore, we're going to see a much larger expansion of kind of the extraterritorial reach of U.S. export control law. So a lot of people in the industry, in my industry, in export control law, are talking about this as a very realistic, possible thing that's coming down the pike. For those of you who have kind of had to deal with this as it relates to Huawei, it can get quite complicated, and we'll talk, I think, a little bit more in the podcast today about some ways to prepare yourself. But the foreign direct product rule and the intricacies of it and how it's developed for certain countries or for certain companies as opposed to others can make this for quite it creates a lot of difficulty sometimes in making sure that companies are compliant with it. But I think that the expansion of the FDPR is very, very realistic in making sure not just that the U.S. is controlling what's coming out of the U.S., but the U.S. is really able to control what is coming out of other countries. So, for example, China. China is not likely to impose sanctions on Russia if they invade Ukraine. There are certainly other companies or other countries, I should say, the UK, I think Japan just the other day, if not today, got on board and said, yes, we're going to mirror what our allies are doing. But, countries like China, right, may not impose the same sanctions that the UK and the US do. So a way to still limit what's coming out of China is the U.S. government imposes the foreign direct product rule, thereby products and equipment that is manufactured in China that still has that U.S. origin touch point is potentially also going to be restricted from going to Russia. So that's a very long-winded explanation, but it gets complicated, and I think the foreign direct product rule is a very realistic consequence of a potential Ukrainian invasion. The other things, of course, are adding specific Russian entities to what's called the specially designated nationals list. This is a OFAC list. If you're an SDN, you are a blocked person, right? You, as a U.S. person or a U.S. company, you are blocked. You are prohibited from dealing with companies or entities or people on the SDN list. So, companies like Rosneft or Gazprom, an assortment of other companies that are either already on that list or could be added to that list is another way of having really targeted sanctions. So it's being discussed right now. In fact, I believe the Republicans in the Senate actually proposed a bill, if not, I think it was yesterday, that would focus on this exact issue with regard to the Nord Stream pipeline, which effectively could cut off Germany and other countries in Europe from a lot of critical natural gas supplies that are coming from Russia. And part of that legislation specifically focuses on making certain Putin cronies and companies fall within the specially designated nationals list, and therefore they would be a prohibited or a blocked entity. There's other kind of more, if we want to talk generally, prohibiting Russian entities from accessing the U.S. financial system, prohibiting U.S. persons or entities from investing in Russian companies or requiring them to divest if they have an interest in any Russian companies. We saw with Iran the use of secondary sanctions, so imposing what we call secondary sanctions on entities or individuals that conduct transactions with Russia or with Russian sanctioned parties. So secondary sanctions, sometimes a little controversial and not always easy to comply with, but essentially we are sanctioning those parties who do business with sanctioned parties. Freezing Russian assets located in the U.S., banning Russian assistance to certain Russian entities, and obviously withholding any type of aid to any organizations that assist Russia. And then, of course, from an import side, prohibiting certain Russian imports or imposing, incredibly high tariffs or higher than usual tariffs on specific Russian imports. So those are all potential sanctions that could be coming down the pike. From a state perspective, and we saw this a lot with Iran and Iranian sanctions, there are U.S. state-level sanctions that are also possible. Texas, where you are, for example, has U.S. state-level sanctions against Iran, meaning that the state has enacted laws that prohibit businesses in that state from investing in or doing business in certain firms that conduct transactions with Iran. And we could see the same type of move with U.S. state-level sanctions with regard to Russia. So the state of Texas, the state of Arizona, where I am, imposing sanctions on state firms and companies that are doing business with Russian companies. So that is quite a long list and an exhaustive answer. But I think just trying to give our listeners an idea of the potential sanctions that could be headed our way. I think that the foreign direct product rule is at the top of that list, a very, very realistic one, and probably at the bottom of that list in terms of not being as realistic is moving Russia into the country group country group E category, which essentially would ban all investment, all transactions, et cetera. And then somewhere in between is probably what we will see with an invasion, which is more Russian entities, companies, individuals being named to the specially designated national list or other or similar types of lists like those.
We'll be right back with more from Matt Silverman after a quick word from our sponsor. Matt, let me circle back to one of the potential sanctions you listed, and that's secondary sanctions. I raised that because we saw the Trump administration talk more extensively about secondary sanctions, particularly around Iran, than I'd heard in a long time. But the thing that I got out of the potential secondary sanctions is that it exponentially increases the reach of sanctions, number one. Number two, it can make it extraordinarily difficult sometimes to know whether you violated a secondary sanctions or not. And three, which of course requires much more extensive due diligence and drives up yet additional costs. So I was wondering if you might go into a little more detail about secondary sanctions, and does it really expand out the reach much more, or am I just got it wrong?
No, you do, and that's why when I stated it, I did mention that it's somewhat controversial, if that's the right topic, or it's certainly a headache for a lot of companies who are trying to do the right thing, trying to be compliant, making sure that, and we'll talk about this a little later, but making sure that they're doing their due diligence, they're screening their customers, they know who they're doing business with, they're not doing business with sanctioned parties or entities. It's a little bit harder when it comes to secondary sanctions, and there have been lots of companies who, whether through maybe no fault of their own, or if they had done a little more due diligence, they probably would have been better protected. But they are doing business with companies unaware that those companies are doing business with sanctioned entities, or in the case of Iran, with Iranian entities or companies or parties, et cetera. So the secondary sanctions, it can be very difficult to make sure that you are in compliance with them. Obviously, the most important part there is knowing your customer, knowing who you're doing business with. I mean, sometimes it is literally as easy as going onto someone's website and seeing who their suppliers are, or who their customers are, or who their business partners are, and if there are red flags raised because they're doing business with on a certain project or customer who's in Iran or who's in Cuba or Syria, et cetera, doing a little bit further due diligence on those. There are, companies who can provide you with consulting services, and companies and content providers who can provide you with additional information on certain companies who may be dealing with sanctioned parties, or may be dealing in areas of the world that raises a red flag, where you need to say to yourself, okay, we know that this customer who we're selling to, or we know that the supplier who we're dealing with, we know that they're not in a prohibited country, or we know that they're not on a sanctioned party list. But we have information now, or we've done some due diligence, or we've received information from this content provider that they may potentially be violating secondary sanctions issues because of who they are doing business with. So some of it's as simple as, and I don't say simple, simple is probably not the right word, but sometimes it's as simple as going onto a website, but also, knowing your customer, knowing your suppliers, providing them with end-use statements, providing them with maybe a letter to sign that assures you, the company, that they are not in turn doing business with any entities, parties, or even entire countries where secondary sanctions issues could then provide a problem. And that's just a way, obviously you can't police the entire world, but it's another way to mitigate any potential secondary sanctions violations. But you're absolutely right. Secondary sanctions certainly expand the scope of potential liability and can be quite a headache for companies to comply with, even if they're doing everything that they should be, or have a very good compliance program already in place.
That concludes part one of our special two-part episode on potential sanctions against Russia if Russia invades Ukraine. Join us again next week, where I bring back Matt to look at what you can do to prepare for this eventuality. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. I hope you will check out my 5-part podcast series on the trial of the century, the Enron trial, which recently premiered on the Compliance Podcast Network. In this podcast series, I visit with business journalist Lauren Steffi, who covered the trial for the Houston Chronicle as its business columnist. We take a look at what led to the trial, some of the key witnesses and moments from the trial, and what the trial inevitably meant going forward. It's a fascinating look at the Enron trial some 15 years after it occurred. I know you'll enjoy this special podcast series. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.